So in this video, we'll further kind of examine this notion of existential freedom and what humanism is, specifically how existentialism is a humanism. So in the prior video for part 2 of existentialism as a humanism, I talked about the concepts of intersubjectivity and the human condition and universality. So we have all of this freedom, but how do we deal with it? Can we judge people still for committing unethical actions? Well, because there's no God and there is no human nature, we can't really turn to anything to help us figure out how we should act. We have to figure that out. So there's no universal sense of morality. So when it comes to judging others, we cannot judge people for existentialism on the basis of what's right or what's wrong or what's good or what's bad, because that's all going to be different depending upon who we are and what choices we've made. Morality for Sartre, as he says, is like a work of art. It's not a priori, so it's not universal and consistent all the time. It changes. But think about a work of art. If any of you are artists, or you write your own music, or you engage in visual art with painting or photography, or even just writing a paper, for example, you don't always know how that work of art is going to turn out until you actually create it. So there's a process of creation and invention that goes into art. And Sartre says this is what morality is like. We are creating and we are inventing our own morality through our choices, through our decisions. So therefore, we cannot judge other people based off of things that we tend to judge people about, like morality, because there is no universal morality. It's something that we have to figure out. And so, well, what do we do then? Can people just kill each other? Can people just violate one another's consent because we have no universal morality? That's not what Sartre is saying. So we are not saying, existentialists are not saying that it's okay to just do whatever you feel like because you're defining your own morality. No. But we still can judge people, but it's based off of something else. So how can we judge people? Sartre says we can judge people based off of how we choose other people's presence. So who do we hang out with? Who do we spend our time with? Because that obviously impacts us. And more specifically, we can judge people based off of good faith and bad faith. So what is good faith? What is bad faith? Bad faith, if you remember from our very first video, is this notion of inconsistency. It's being a hypocrite. It's saying that, well, it's okay for me to do this, but it's not okay for anyone else to do this. That's what bad faith is. So you're making excuses for yourself, you're hiding your bad conscience, you are not embracing your free will, you're just saying, well, this is my human nature, so I'm always going to be angry all the time. Whereas good faith is this quest for freedom. You are acting upon your freedom, you're really thinking through everything, you're acting with a sense of despair, you know that you can't necessarily control everything. So good faith is a quest for freedom. And so how does this kind of come to play then when we can judge people? We can judge people based off of whether they're acting in good faith. Do they know what they're doing? Are they negatively impacting other people's freedom? Have they fully thought out what they're doing? Are they thinking about their universality with the rest of humanity? Or are they just completely ignoring it? Sartre thinks of good faith and bad faith as a quest for truth versus a quest for error or falsity. So one is true, one is false. And that is how we can judge people. Are they living authentically? Do they know what they're doing? Have they thought about universality? And have they really had that impact and filter in through their decisions? And so Sartre uses the example of two women who have very different types of moralities. But for existentialists, they're judged in the exact same way because they're judged in relation to their commitment to freedom. So one woman who had more traditional values was in love with another person, was in love with another man, but she respected this sense of duty. She respected this sense of obligation and that he was already taken and committed to someone else. And so she was not going to she wasn't going to ruin that for someone else. And so that is how she lives her life. She lives her life by duty. She really thought about it. She still acted upon her free will, but she's committed to different principles than the second woman that Sartre talks about. The second woman does choose to live by her passions, and she does what she wants. And so she went for this guy, even though he was taken, and even though it wasn't necessarily celebrated in society to do something like that, because she has chosen freedom, and this is what she's going to do with her freedom. So two very different moralities, two very different ways of existing. But for existentialists, they're judged in the same way because they both have freedom as a foundation for their values. They have committed to those values through their own free will. And so this is how we can judge other people, through authenticity. Authenticity is a guideline. Are you living an authentic life? Meaning, are you engaging in your choices in the name of freedom? So this means that sometimes you might make choices that still go along with societal expectations, right? Maybe you still decide you want to get married and have kids, and that is what people expect of people in society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're violating free will. It just means that you've given thought to it and you've committed to something and you know what you're committed to. Whereas someone might realize, you know what, I don't want to get married, I don't want to have kids, and that's okay. That's also goodwill or good faith, right? We are doing this with this notion that I have really thought about this and I don't necessarily have to do what society wants me to do, and I can either go along with it or not go along with it. But it's bad faith if I just go through the motions and say, you know what, well, my parents want me to get married, they want me to have kids, so therefore I'm just going to go through these motions without really thinking about it, and then I'm going to be miserable, and then I'm going to be a bad parent to my kids or just leave them or something. So that's what it means to live in good faith versus bad faith, or to live authentically versus inauthentically. Sometimes it will go along with what societal standards are like at that time, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And so when we think then about freedom and existentialism, it truly is this notion of being freely committed to things. You still care about things. Sartre, for example, talks about how he's committed to the abolition of private property. He doesn't necessarily know whether it's going to happen in his lifetime, but he's still going to do things to strive towards it. Or for example, I'm committed to my teaching. I'm committed to teaching philosophy to others. I'm committed to helping other people become more aware of themselves and their meaning and purpose in life. But I can't necessarily control how everyone is going to receive that information. I can't necessarily control whether everyone's reading the book or listening to these videos or, paying attention in class. I can't control those things, but I'm still making this free commitment. And no one wanted me to teach philosophy. My parents surely didn't want me to teach philosophy, but it's something that I came to realize on my own through really doing some introspection and realizing, this is fulfilling for me. This has to do with the purpose that I've constructed for myself in my life. So that's how freedom and authenticity work. So now, if you think about the title, Existentialism is a Humanism, we get the existentialism part. But what does it mean for it to be a humanism? So let's think about humanism. Sartre gives two definitions for humanism. The first one is the traditional notion of humanism, that every human is intrinsically valuable, and we have this innate sense of dignity, and we should always celebrate ourselves and celebrate other people, and we should always be respected. First version of humanism. Sartre says this is not the type of humanism that existentialism is. Why not? Well, Sartre believes that this is an oversimplification of humanism. He believes that just worshiping human beings based off of the accomplishments of a few human beings leads to a misguided fascism. He says that in order to truly assess humanity, you have to be outside of the realm of humanity. You would have to be a cat or a dog or a fish or something, and he says that would be impossible. So we as human beings are just celebrating ourselves, but of course we're going to celebrate ourselves because we have that intrinsic bias of being human. And so he says that this first type of humanism leads to a misguided fascism, where we end up kind of celebrating ourselves and diminishing other beings. So for example, we human beings think that they're better than animals, and so they use that as a justification for exploiting them and eating them and doing all these terrible things and clearing rainforests and everything. We think we're better than plants, and so those are some examples of this misguided fascism, that we're human beings, we have this intrinsic value, and therefore other species do not have that intrinsic value. Well, that's really problematic, and that doesn't lead to good things for Sartre. So the second type of humanism is what existentialism is. So the second type of humanism is basically that to be human means to be free. No matter what kind of condition we're in, we still technically have this free will. And so to be human means that we are always transcending towards the future. We are always engaged in these projects that go beyond the present, or that go beyond my facticity being the givens in my life. So I'm born into this body. I'm born in a specific time. I'm born into a specific family. I'm born into a specific country and culture. And so while those profoundly impact my life, those don't necessarily define me. So to be human means to transcend. So we are always transcending or going beyond our situation and our limitations, because that's what it means to be human. We're going to school, we're educating ourselves, we're reading, we're learning new languages, we are traveling, we are loving people and helping people through volunteering or through engaging in a family or things like that, or friendship. So we as human beings are always transcending. That is a second version of humanism, which existentialism is. So to be human means that we are free. No matter our circumstances, we technically have that freedom. And so we're always changing. And that's what existentialism is. That's a kind of humanism that existentialism is. So what do we do? Because a lot of people are upset about the fact that, well, this sounds great, but there's no God. What do I do? Sartre says that existentialism is not really concerned about disproving or proving whether God exists. But for Sartre, there are more urgent problems than whether God exists or not. So the urgent problem is, how can we live as human beings? That's what we have to figure out. And so that's what existentialism is trying to figure out. How do we live as human beings? Because even if there is a God, Sartre says, no one can save us but ourselves. We have to figure out our own problems in this world. We can't just turn to a God whether God exists or not. And so that's kind of the whole tricky relationship that atheistic existentialism has with God. They don't really care about disproving that God exists, but they're saying we have all of these other problems and we have to figure that out, and that's far more urgent than figuring out whether God exists or not, because we can't really prove that. So that is existentialism is a humanism in a nutshell.